James Carter had seen it all in his 45 years of building his empire. Employees stealing company funds, business partners lying to his face, charity workers pocketing donations meant for the poor. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. So when he found a 12-year-old black girl sleeping in the doorway of his Manhattan office building at 2 a.m., his first thought wasn't sympathy. It was suspicion. "Another street kid looking for an easy target," he muttered, watching Chloe through his car window. She looked harmless enough, curled up in a torn jacket that was too big for her small frame. But James had learned that desperation could make anyone dangerous. He decided to test her. Stepping out of his Bentley, James pretended to stumble, dropping his wallet and Rolex watch near where she lay sleeping. Then he slumped against his car, closed his eyes, and waited. What happened next would shatter everything James thought he knew about human nature. Instead of grabbing his valuables and running, Chloe did something that froze James to his core. Something so unexpected, so pure, that it revealed not only her true character, but also the heartbreaking reason she was on the streets. If you're someone who appreciates emotional stories, we'd love for you to like and subscribe. There's more to come that might move you too. James Carter's empire hadn't been built on trust. At 45, he owned 17 companies, lived in a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, and had learned the hard way that everyone wanted something from him. Money, connections, opportunities, it didn't matter. People saw his wealth and suddenly became very friendly, very helpful, and very dishonest. The lesson had been beaten into him over decades of broken partnerships, stolen ideas, and employees who smiled to his face while embezzling from his accounts. His first business partner had disappeared with half their startup funds. His ex-wife had married him for his money and divorced him for more of it. Even the charity organizations he donated to had been caught using funds for personal expenses instead of helping the people they claimed to serve. So when James pulled up to his Manhattan office building at 2 a.m. after a grueling business dinner, the last thing he expected was to find a child sleeping in his doorway. But there she was, a small black girl, maybe 12 years old, curled up against the glass doors of Carter Industries, like a discarded piece of clothing. James sat in his Bentley for several minutes, engine running, studying the situation. The girl was tiny, even for her age, wearing a jacket that was clearly meant for someone much larger. Her sneakers had holes in them, and she'd fashioned a pillow from a garbage bag filled with what looked like newspapers. She was sleeping so deeply that she didn't even stir when a police car drove by with its sirens wailing. His first instinct was to call security. Carter Industries employed the best private security firm in New York precisely to keep situations like this from happening. The building was supposed to be monitored 24 hours a day. How had a homeless child managed to set up camp right outside his front door? But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way she'd positioned herself, not sprawled carelessly like someone who didn't care about the space they occupied, but curled up neatly in the corner, trying to take up as little room as possible. Or maybe it was how young she looked, her face peaceful in sleep despite obviously having nowhere safe to go. James turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold February night. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. How long had she been sleeping out here? How was she not freezing to death? As he got closer, he could see more details. The girl's hair was braided neatly, though the style was a few days old and starting to come loose. Her clothes were clean but worn thin, and despite her obvious poverty, she didn't smell like someone who'd been living on the streets for long. She looked more like a child who'd recently lost her home, rather than someone who'd been homeless for months or years. James's cynical mind immediately began calculating possibilities. Was this some kind of setup? A sob story designed to tug at his heartstrings and open his wallet? He'd seen it before. Elaborate schemes involving children, disabled people, or elderly individuals, all designed to prey on the sympathies of wealthy marks. Just last month, a woman had approached him outside his favorite restaurant with a crying baby, claiming she needed money for formula. His security team had later discovered she was part of an organized begging ring that used borrowed children as props. The smart thing would be to call the police and let them handle it. Child services would take the girl to a safe place, and James could get on with his evening without getting involved in someone else's problems. That's what the old James would have done. The James who'd learned to protect himself by keeping everyone at arm's length. But something about this situation felt different. The girl wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't positioned strategically to catch the attention of passers-by. She was genuinely trying to sleep, huddled in the corner where she'd be least likely to be noticed or bothered. An idea began forming in James's mind. Not a kind idea, but a practical one born from years of disappointment and betrayal. If this girl was genuine, if she really was just a homeless child looking for shelter, then she'd prove it by her actions. But if she was part of some scam, If she was waiting for a mark like him to show up, then she'd reveal her true nature soon enough. James walked back to his Bentley and retrieved several items from his briefcase. His wallet, thick with cash and credit cards. His Rolex Submariner, worth more than most people's cars. His phone, a custom model that cost $5,000. He set these items on the ground near where the girl was sleeping, making sure they were visible but not obviously planted. Then came the performance. James stumbled slightly, as if he'd been drinking, and leaned heavily against his car. He loosened his tie and let his head fall back, breathing deeply like someone on the verge of passing out. To any observer, he would look like a wealthy businessman who'd had too much to drink and was taking a moment to collect himself before driving home. But James wasn't drunk. His eyes weren't completely closed. Through barely parted lids, he watched and waited. The test was simple. If the girl was a genuine homeless child, she might wake up and be startled by his presence, but she wouldn't try to rob him. She'd probably try to help him or simply move away to avoid trouble. But if she was part of a scam, if she was really working with accomplices or had been planted there to target wealthy victims, then she'd see the scattered valuables as an opportunity. 10 minutes passed. The girl didn't move. James began to wonder if she was sleeping more deeply than he'd thought, or if she was sick. The temperature was still dropping, and he could see her shivering slightly even in her sleep. 20 minutes. James's legs were getting cramped from standing in the same position, and he was starting to feel genuinely cold despite his expensive coat. The girl stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep, but didn't wake up. 30 minutes. James was beginning to feel foolish. What was he trying to prove? That a homeless child was either a saint or a criminal. The test seemed cruel now, leaving a little girl sleeping in freezing temperatures while he played elaborate games with his valuables. But just as he was about to abandon his experiment, the girl's eyes opened. Chloe sat up slowly, blinking in confusion as she took in her surroundings. For a moment she looked lost, like someone waking up from a deep dream and struggling to remember where they were. Then her eyes focused on James, slumped against his expensive car, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. She stood up carefully, her movements stiff from sleeping on cold concrete. James could see her more clearly now. She was definitely around 12, with large brown eyes and a face that would have been beautiful if it wasn't marked by exhaustion and worry. She looked at James for a long moment, then noticed the scattered items on the ground around him. James held his breath. This was the moment of truth. Would she grab his wallet and run? Would she call out for accomplices who were waiting nearby? Or would she prove that his cynicism was wrong? What happened next surprised James so completely that he almost broke character. Chloe didn't touch his valuables. Instead, she walked over to him and gently touched his shoulder. "Sir? Sir? Are you okay?" Her voice was soft, concerned, with just a hint of the accent that suggested her family had roots in the South. "Sir, you shouldn't sleep out here. It's really cold tonight." James didn't respond, maintaining his act of being barely conscious. Chloe looked around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone else was nearby who might help. "Sir, I think you dropped some things," she said, and James's heart began to race. Here it comes, he thought. She's going to help by collecting his valuables. But Chloe didn't pick up his wallet or his watch. Instead, she knelt down and began carefully gathering the items, holding them protectively against her chest. "Sir, you need to wake up. You can't leave these things on the ground. Someone might steal them." She shook his shoulder more firmly. "Please, sir, you need to get in your car and go home where it's warm." James was stunned. Not only was she not trying to rob him, she was actively trying to protect his valuables and get him to safety. When he still didn't respond, she made a decision that completely shattered his expectations. Chloe looked around until she found a piece of cardboard from a nearby dumpster. She placed it on the ground next to James, then carefully arranged his wallet, watch, and phone on top of it, keeping them off the dirty ground but making sure they were still clearly visible to him when he woke up. Then she took off her own jacket, the only real protection she had against the cold, and draped it over James's shoulders. "You'll get sick out here, sir," she whispered. "This will help keep you warm until you feel better." James felt tears stinging his eyes. This child, who had nothing, was giving him her only coat because she thought he needed it more than she did. She was shivering in just a thin sweater, but she was worried about his comfort. Chloe settled back into her corner, but she didn't go back to sleep. Instead, she kept watch, glancing over at James every few minutes to make sure he was okay. When a group of loud teenagers walked by, she actually stood up and positioned herself between them and James, as if her small frame could somehow protect him from potential trouble. For 2 hours, she maintained her vigil. When it started to snow lightly, she found a piece of plastic and held it over James's head to keep him dry. When a police car slowed down, clearly suspicious of the situation, she waved politely and pointed to James, indicating that she was watching over him. By 4 a.m., James couldn't continue the charade any longer. His heart was breaking watching this child sacrifice her own comfort and safety for a stranger she believed needed help. He had never been more wrong about anyone in his life. Slowly, James began to wake up, stretching and groaning as if coming out of a deep, alcohol-induced sleep. Chloe immediately rushed over to him. "Oh, good. You're awake. I was worried about you." She helped him stand, her small hands surprisingly strong as she steadied him. "Your things are right here, sir. I made sure nobody took them." James looked down at the cardboard where his valuables were neatly arranged, then at the jacket draped around his shoulders, the jacket that had kept him warm while she shivered. You stayed awake? All night?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I wanted to make sure you were safe," Chloe said simply. "It's dangerous to sleep outside alone, especially when you have nice things. Bad people might try to hurt you." James stared at this remarkable child, who had just taught him more about human nature in one night than he'd learned in 45 years of living. She had nothing, and yet she'd given him everything she had. She was homeless, hungry, and cold. But her first concern had been for his safety. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Chloe," she said, then immediately looked worried. "I'm sorry for sleeping by your building, sir. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I'll move on, I promise." "No," James said quickly. "Don't go. I want to help you. What are you doing out here alone? Where's your family?" For the first time, Chloe's composure cracked slightly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. "It's okay, sir. You don't need to worry about me. I'll be fine." But James could see that she wasn't fine. She was a child, alone on the streets of New York in the middle of winter, and she'd just proven that she had a heart bigger than anyone he'd ever known. "Chloe," he said gently, "I'm James, and I think it's time you let someone worry about you for a change." The warmth of James's Bentley was like stepping into another world. As Chloe settled into the heated leather passenger seat, James couldn't help but notice how she tried to make herself as small as possible, as if she was afraid of taking up too much space in his car. Her hands were nearly purple from the cold, and she kept them tucked under her arms, still shivering despite the car's heater running at full blast. "When did you last eat?" James asked, studying her thin frame in the dim light of the dashboard. Chloe hesitated, looking down at her hand. "Yesterday morning. There's a church on 42nd Street that gives out sandwiches on Tuesdays." Yesterday morning. James felt his chest tighten. This child had been without food for over 30 hours, and yet her first concern had been for his safety. He pulled out his phone and called his driver. "Marcus, I need you to bring the car around to the Carter Industries building. Now. And stop at the all-night diner on Broadway. Get whatever they have that's hot and filling. Enough for 2 people. It's 4:30 a.m., Mr. Carter." His driver's confused voice came through the phone. "Are you sure you don't want me to just pick you up?" "I'm sure. 20 minutes. James hung up and turned to Chloe, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "You don't have to do that, sir," she said quickly. "I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not trouble, Chloe. And call me James." He paused, then asked the question that had been weighing on his mind since he'd watched her give up her jacket for a stranger. "Can you tell me how you ended up sleeping outside my building?" Chloe was quiet for so long that James wondered if she was going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandmother died 3 weeks ago." James waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She raised me since I was 5. My mom left when I was little, and I never knew my dad. Grandma worked as a cleaning lady for office buildings downtown. She wasn't rich, but we had a little apartment in Queens, and she made sure I went to school every day." Chloe's voice got stronger as she talked about her grandmother, and James could hear the love and respect in every word. "Grandma always said education was the most important thing. She'd help me with my homework every night, even though she only went to school until 6th grade herself. She said she wanted me to have opportunities she never had." "She sounds like a wonderful woman," James said softly. "She was everything to me," Chloe continued, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "When she got sick last year, I tried to take care of her. The doctors said she had diabetes, but she couldn't afford all her medicine. She kept working even when she felt terrible because she said we needed the money for rent and my school supply." James felt anger building in his chest, not at Chloe or her grandmother, but at a system that forced an elderly woman to choose between her health and keeping a roof over her granddaughter's head. "What happened when she died?" he asked gently. The landlord came 2 days after the funeral. He said since Grandma was the only one on the lease, I had to leave. I tried to explain that I was still in school, that I just needed time to figure things out, but he said it wasn't his problem. He gave me 3 days to pack up everything. Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and James noticed how young she looked in that moment. Not like the mature, responsible girl who'd watched over him all night, but like the frightened child she really was. "I tried to stay with friends from school, but their families don't have much money either. Most of them live in tiny apartments that are already crowded. I stayed with my friend Maria's family for a week, but I could tell I was making things hard for them. They were feeding me when they barely had enough food for themselves. So you decided to live on the streets rather than be a burden to people you cared about," James said, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "I figured I could take care of myself until I turned 18. I'm smart, and I know how to stay out of trouble. I found places to sleep that were safe, and I learned which places gave out free food. I even found a public library where I could do homework and use the computers." "Homework?" James asked, surprised. "I'm still going to school," Chloe said, a note of pride in her voice. "P.S. 234 on the Lower East Side. I use a friend's address so they don't ask questions about where I live. Grandma always said that no matter what happened, I had to finish my education." James stared at this remarkable child, who was living on the streets but still attending school every day, still doing homework, still planning for a future that must have seemed impossible from where she sat. "Chloe, what grade are you in?" "7th. I'm supposed to graduate from middle school in June. I want to go to high school and then college. I want to be a teacher, like the ones who helped me when I was struggling with reading when I was little." The simple certainty in her voice broke James's heart. Here was a homeless child who still believed in her dreams, who still saw education as her way out of poverty, who was willing to sleep in doorways if it meant she could keep going to school. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with bags of food from the diner. James had never seen anyone eat with such quiet dignity while being so obviously hungry. Chloe thanked him between every bite, and when he encouraged her to eat more, she carefully wrapped half the sandwich to save for later. "Chloe," James said after she'd finished eating, "I have a proposition for you." She looked at him warily, and James realized she'd probably learned to be suspicious of adults who offered to help. "I have a large apartment, too large, really, for one person. There are guest rooms that never get used. I'd like you to stay there, at least until we can figure out a more permanent solution." "I can't pay rent," Chloe said immediately. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me help." "Why?" The question was direct, and James could see the intelligence behind it. This girl had learned to question motives, to look for the catch in offers that seemed too good to be true. James thought about how to answer. How could he explain that in one night, she'd shown him more genuine kindness than he'd experienced in years? How could he tell her that watching her sacrifice for a stranger had made him realize how empty his own life had become? "Because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he said finally. "You reminded me that there are still good people in the world. People who help others not because of what they can get in return, but because it's the right thing to do." Chloe was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light. "What if it doesn't work out?" she asked. "What if you decide you don't want me around anymore? Then we'll figure something else out. But Chloe, I promise you won't end up back on the streets. Whatever happens, I'll make sure you have a safe place to live and that you can keep going to school." "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I know enough. I know you're brave enough to live on your own rather than burden people you care about. I know you're dedicated enough to keep going to school even when you're homeless. I know you're kind enough to take care of a stranger who you thought needed help." James paused. "I know you're exactly the kind of person your grandmother raised you to be." At the mention of her grandmother, Chloe's composure finally broke completely. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Not the quiet, controlled crying she'd done earlier, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who'd been trying to be strong for too long. James didn't try to stop her or tell her everything would be okay. He simply sat with her, letting her grieve for everything she'd lost and fear for everything that was uncertain about her future. When her crying finally subsided, Chloe looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. "I miss her so much," she whispered. "I know," James said, "and you always will. But she'd be proud of you, Chloe. She'd be proud of how you've survived, how you've stayed in school, how you helped a stranger tonight even when you had nothing to give." Do you really mean it? About letting me stay with you? I mean it. We'll go to my apartment right now if you want. You can take a hot shower, get some sleep in a real bed, and then we'll figure out the rest. Chloe nodded slowly, and James could see her making the difficult decision to trust him. As they drove through the empty streets of Manhattan toward James's penthouse, he found himself thinking about how completely his night had changed. 12 hours ago, he'd been a cynical businessman who trusted no one and helped no one. Now he was bringing home a homeless child who'd shown him what real goodness looked like. James? Chloe's voice was sleepy now, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Yeah? Thank you for believing in me. James glanced over at her, curled up in the passenger seat of his Bentley, and realized that she had it backward. She was the one who'd made him believe. In kindness, in selflessness, in the possibility that people could be good without expecting anything in return. Thank you, Chloe, he said quietly, for reminding me what it means to be human. As they pulled into the underground garage of his building, James knew that his life would never be the same. This child had passed his test in ways he'd never expected, and in doing so, she'd changed everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. The real test, he realized, was just beginning. Now he had to prove that he was worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. James's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a luxury building overlooking Central Park. As they stepped off the private elevator, Chloe's eyes widened at the sight of the marble foyer, the crystal chandelier, and the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. But what struck James most was how she didn't touch anything. She kept her hands clasped behind her back, walking carefully across the polished floors as if she was afraid of leaving footprints. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to take advantage of his wealth. This was a child overwhelmed by luxuries she'd never imagined. "This is your home?" she asked softly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It is. And for now, it's yours too." James watched her take in the surroundings, the expensive artwork on the walls, the custom furniture, the grand piano that he'd bought but never learned to play. "Are you okay?" Chloe nodded, but James could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She looked like she was afraid to breathe too loudly in case she disturbed something. "Chloe, I want you to understand something important. This isn't a museum, it's a home, and homes are meant to be lived in. You don't have to be afraid of touching things or sitting down or making yourself comfortable." She looked at him skeptically, as if testing whether he really meant it. "I'm serious," James continued. "The guest bedroom has its own bathroom, a comfortable bed, and plenty of space for your things. There's a study where you can do homework, and the kitchen is always stocked with food. This isn't temporary charity. This is your home for as long as you need it to be." James led her down a hallway lined with more artwork than most museums possessed. He opened the door to what he'd always called the Blue Guest Room, though it had never actually hosted a guest in the 5 years he'd lived here. The room was larger than most people's entire apartments. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered another stunning view of the city. There was a sitting area with comfortable chairs, a large desk for studying, and built-in bookshelves filled with classics that James had bought for decoration but never read. "This would be your room," he said, watching Chloe's reaction. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, not entering. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "James, I can't stay here." "Why not?" "Because this is too much. This room is bigger than the apartment I shared with Grandma. The bathroom probably costs more than she made in a year." Chloe turned to look at him, tears in her eyes. "I'm grateful. I really am. But I don't belong in a place like this." James felt his heart break a little. This child had been sleeping on concrete, had gone without food for over a day, had been taking care of herself on the streets of New York, and she was worried about whether she deserved comfort. "Chloe, can I tell you something about this apartment?" She nodded. "I bought it 7 years ago because I thought owning expensive things would make me happy. I filled it with art I don't really understand and furniture I barely use. I have 12 rooms, but I spend most of my time in just 3 of them. Do you know how many friends I've had over for dinner in the past year?" Chloe shook her head. "0. Not one. I eat alone, I sleep alone, and I wake up every morning in this beautiful, empty space wondering why I feel so hollow inside." James sat down in one of the chairs, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Last night, when I watched you give me your jacket, when I saw you stay awake for hours to protect a stranger, I realized something. I have everything money can buy, but you have something I've been missing my whole life. You have a good heart." Chloe was quiet, processing his words. You think you don't belong here because you don't have money, James continued. But I think maybe I'm the one who doesn't belong here. Maybe this place needs someone who knows what it means to take care of others. Someone who understands that the most valuable things in life can't be bought. I don't understand, Chloe said softly. I'm saying that maybe we can help each other. You need a safe place to live and continue your education. I need someone to remind me what it means to be human. It seems like a fair trade to me. Chloe walked slowly into the room, running her hand along the edge of the desk. What if I break something? What if I mess up your nice things? Then we'll fix them or replace them. Things are just things, Chloe. They're not important. You are. For the first time since they'd arrived, Chloe smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but genuine. Can I really use this desk for homework? It's your desk now, and there's a computer in the study down the hall that you can use for school projects. High-speed internet, printer, whatever you need. Chloe sat down at the desk and ran her hands across its polished surface. Grandma would have loved this. She always did her bills and wrote letters at our tiny kitchen table. She used to say that someday I'd have a proper desk where I could spread out all my books and really concentrate on my studies. She sounds like a smart woman. What else did she used to tell you? She said that education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me. She said that even if I lost everything else, if I had knowledge and the ability to think for myself, I could rebuild my life anywhere. Chloe's voice grew stronger as she talked about her grandmother's lessons. She used to say that being poor wasn't something to be ashamed of, but being ignorant was a choice. James felt a deep respect for a woman he'd never met. A cleaning lady who'd worked multiple jobs to support her granddaughter, but had still found time to instill values and wisdom that many wealthy parents failed to teach their children. She also used to tell me stories about her childhood in Georgia, Chloe continued. Her family picked cotton and tobacco, and she was the first person in her family to learn to read. She said that when she was my age, she dreamed of living in a place where black children could go to any school they wanted and become anything they dreamed of becoming. And here you are, doing exactly that, James said. She must have been incredibly proud of you. I hope so. I tried so hard to make good grades for her. Even these past few weeks, sleeping outside, I've been keeping up with my assignments. I couldn't let her down, even after she was gone. James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Chloe, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Okay? Are you afraid of me? Are you worried about living here with a man you barely know? It was a question that had been weighing on his mind. He realized how this situation must look. A wealthy older man taking in a homeless young girl. He needed to know that she felt safe, that she understood she could leave anytime she wanted. Chloe was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. At first, I was scared, she admitted. When you woke up and started asking me questions, I thought maybe you were going to call the police or hurt me somehow. I've learned to be careful around adults I don't know. And now? Now I think you're probably the first adult since Grandma died who actually sees me as a person instead of a problem to be solved. Chloe turned to face him. You didn't try to pat me on the head and tell me everything would be okay. You didn't make me feel like I should be grateful for whatever scraps you threw my way. You talked to me like I was smart enough to understand what was happening and make my own choices. James felt a lump forming in his throat. You are smart enough. You're one of the smartest people I've ever met, regardless of age. Can I ask you something now? Of course. Why did you really put your wallet and watch on the ground like that? You weren't really drunk, were you? James felt his face flush with shame. He'd hoped she hadn't noticed his deception, but of course she had. This girl was far too perceptive to miss something like that. No, I wasn't drunk. I was testing you. Testing me how? James sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk where Chloe was sitting. I wanted to see if you would try to steal from me. I've had so many experiences with people taking advantage of my money that I assumed you might be doing the same thing. Chloe was quiet for a long moment, and James braced himself for her anger. He deserved it. He'd subjected a homeless child to an elaborate test based on his own cynicism and distrust. So, you thought I was a thief, she said finally. I thought you might be. I was wrong. Completely, horribly wrong. What made you change your mind? You gave me your jacket. You stayed awake all night to protect me. You tried to keep me dry when it started snowing. You did all of that for someone you thought was a drunk stranger who might not even remember your kindness in the morning. James looked directly at her. I realize that you have more integrity in your little finger than most adults have in their entire bodies. Chloe nodded slowly, processing this information. Are you angry at me? James asked. For not trusting you from the beginning? A little, she said honestly. But I also understand why you did it. Grandma used to say that when people hurt you enough times, your heart builds walls to protect itself. She said the trick was knowing when it was safe to let those walls down. The wisdom of this 12-year-old continued to astound James. And do you think it's safe for both of us to let our walls down? Chloe smiled, the first truly relaxed smile he'd seen from her. I think maybe we can try, she said. After all, you passed my test too. What test? I stayed awake watching you for 2 hours before you woke up. I was testing whether you were the kind of man who would hurt a girl who was trying to help him, or whether you were someone who could be trusted. James stared at her in amazement. While he'd been testing her honesty, she'd been testing his character. And somehow, despite his deception, despite his cynical assumptions, she'd decided he was worth trusting. So what happens now? He asked. Now I take a hot shower, Chloe said, standing up from the desk. And tomorrow I go to school like always. And maybe, if it's okay with you, I do my homework at this beautiful desk that you're letting me use. It's more than okay with me. It's perfect. As Chloe headed toward the bathroom, she paused at the doorway. James? Not just for the room or the food or any of this. She gestured around the luxurious space. Thank you for seeing me. Really seeing me. Most people look at homeless kids like we're invisible, or like we're something to be afraid of. You looked at me like I was worth knowing. After she closed the bathroom door, James sat alone in the guest room that was no longer a guest room, but Chloe's room, listening to the sound of running water and thinking about how completely his world had changed in less than 24 hours. He'd started the evening as a cynical billionaire who trusted no one. He was ending it as a guardian to a remarkable child who taught him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. And for the first time in years, his enormous, expensive, empty apartment actually felt like home. 2 weeks later, James's penthouse had transformed in ways he'd never expected. The sterile perfection that had once defined his home was slowly giving way to signs of actual life. Chloe's school books were spread across the dining room table, her backpack hung by the front door, and the kitchen counter held the remnants of her attempts to cook dinner for both of them. The change in Chloe herself was even more remarkable. The scared, guarded girl who'd been afraid to touch anything had gradually relaxed into the space. She still maintained a careful politeness, but James could see glimpses of the confident, intelligent young woman she was becoming. This particular Thursday evening, James found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and papers, chewing thoughtfully on the end of her pencil as she worked through what looked like a complex math problem. How's the homework going? He asked, settling into the chair across from her with his laptop and a cup of coffee. It's okay. We're working on algebraic equations, and I'm trying to figure out this word problem about two trains traveling toward each other at different speeds. Chloe looked up at him with a slight frown. I understand the math part, but I keep getting confused about how to set up the equation from the story. James looked at the problem she was pointing to and smiled. Mind if I take a look? You know algebra? I have a degree in business and economics. I had to take a lot of math classes. He pulled the book toward him and read the problem aloud. Two trains leave stations that are 240 miles apart, traveling toward each other. One train travels at 60 miles per hour, and the other at 80 miles per hour. How long will it take for them to meet? See? I know that 60 plus 80 is 140, and I think I'm supposed to divide 240 by 140. But I don't understand why that works. James grabbed a piece of paper and drew a simple diagram. Let's think about it this way. Every hour, the trains get 140 miles closer to each other, because one is moving 60 miles toward the other, and the other is moving 80 miles toward the first one. So together, they're closing the gap by 140 miles every hour. Oh! Chloe's face lit up with understanding. So if they close the gap by 140 miles every hour, and the gap is 240 miles total, then 240 divided by 140 tells me how many hours it takes. Exactly. You got it. Chloe worked through the division, getting 71 hours, then converting it to hours and minutes. As she wrote down her final answer, James found himself marveling at how quickly she grasped concepts once they were explained clearly. Your teachers must be impressed with how well you're doing, he said. Chloe's smile faded slightly. Actually, I've been thinking about that. About school, I mean. What about it? I've been lying to them about where I live. I'm still using my friend Maria's address. But Maria's been asking questions, and I think her parents are getting suspicious about why I never invite anyone over to my place. James set down his coffee cup, recognizing the worry in her voice. Are you afraid they're going to find out you were homeless? I'm afraid they're going to find out I'm living with you, Chloe said quietly. I mean, what am I supposed to tell them? That a billionaire I met on the street took me in? Nobody's going to believe that story. And if they do believe it, they're going to think something weird is going on. James felt a knot forming in his stomach. He'd been so focused on helping Chloe that he hadn't fully considered how their unusual arrangement might look to others, especially to school officials who were trained to be suspicious of exactly these kinds of situations. What do you think we should do? He asked. I don't know. I've been thinking about it for days, and I can't come up with a good solution. If I tell the truth, they'll either not believe me, or they'll call social services. If I keep lying, I'm going to get caught eventually. Chloe pushed her math book aside and looked directly at James. Maybe I should find somewhere else to live. I don't want to cause problems for you. Absolutely not, James said firmly. We're not solving this problem by having you leave. We're going to figure out a way to make this work. How? You can't exactly adopt me or anything. You're not married, you don't have any experience with kids, and we've only known each other for 2 weeks. No court is going to think that's a stable situation for a 12-year-old girl. The matter-of-fact way she analyzed their situation showed James just how much thought Chloe had been putting into this problem. She wasn't being dramatic or emotional. She was being practical, trying to protect both of them from complications that could arise from their unconventional arrangement. Actually, James said slowly, I've been thinking about that too. About making this more official, I mean. Chloe looked at him with surprise. What do you mean? I mean, I've been researching guardianship laws. I've been talking to lawyers about what it would take for me to become your legal guardian. You have? Chloe's voice was barely above a whisper. I have. And yes, it's complicated. There are background checks, home studies, court hearings, and a lot of paperwork. But it's not impossible. James opened his laptop and pulled up a document he'd been working on. I've already started the process. I hired a family attorney, and she's been preparing the initial filings. Chloe stared at the screen, not quite believing what she was seeing. You want to be my guardian? Officially? Chloe, these past 2 weeks have been the best 2 weeks I've had in years. Coming home and finding you here doing homework, having dinner together, hearing about your day at school. It's made me realize what I've been missing my whole life. But why? Why would you want to take on that responsibility? I'm not your family. I'm just some kid you found on the street. James closed the laptop and leaned forward, looking directly at her. Do you remember what you told me about your grandmother? About how she said family isn't just about blood, but about people who choose to love you and stick around when things get hard? Chloe nodded. Well, I'm choosing you, Chloe. I'm choosing to love you and stick around, not because I have to, but because I want to, because you've made my life better in every way that matters. Tears started flowing down Chloe's cheeks, and James felt his own eyes getting misty. But what if they say no? What if the court decides you're not qualified to be my guardian? Then we'll keep fighting until they say yes, and in the meantime, we'll figure out how to handle the school situation. Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What did your lawyer say about our chances? She said it won't be easy. Single men don't typically get custody of 12-year-old girls, especially when there's no prior relationship. But she also said that the fact that you're doing well in school, that you're healthy and happy, and that you want to stay with me will work in our favor. I do want to stay with you, Chloe said quietly. I was so scared that first night. But now this feels like home. You feel like family. James reached across the table and took her hand. You are my family, Chloe. Maybe not by blood or by law yet, but in every way that matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what they were discussing. So, what do we do about school in the meantime? Chloe asked. We tell them the truth. We tell them that you're living with me while we work through the legal guardianship process. We provide them with documentation from my lawyer. We give them references, and we show them that you're thriving in this environment. What if they don't believe us? What if they think something inappropriate is going on? Then we deal with that when it happens. But Chloe, I want you to understand something important. I will never, ever do anything to hurt you or make you uncomfortable. And if anyone questions my motives, we'll address those concerns head-on with complete transparency. Chloe squeezed his hand. I know you won't hurt me. If I didn't trust you completely, I wouldn't be here. Good. Because I need you to promise me that if you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable about anything, you'll tell me immediately. No matter what it is, no matter how small it seems. I promise. James smiled and released her hand. Now, let's figure out how we're going to approach your school. I think we should set up a meeting with your guidance counselor and explain the situation properly. You'd come with me? Of course I'd come with you. We're in this together, remember? Chloe picked up her pencil and went back to her math homework, but James could see that some of the tension had left her shoulders. The problem wasn't solved yet, but at least now she knew she wasn't facing it alone. James, she said without looking up from her work. Yeah? Thank you for wanting to fight for me, for wanting to make this official. Grandma used to tell me that someday I'd find people who would see my worth and choose to invest in my future. I think she would have liked you a lot. I think I would have liked her too. And Chloe? She was right. You are absolutely worth fighting for. As Chloe returned to her homework and James went back to his laptop, the apartment filled with the comfortable sounds of two people sharing space and working toward their individual goals while supporting each other. It was a kind of peace that James had never experienced before, and he knew he would do whatever it took to protect it. The next morning, James called Chloe's school and scheduled a meeting with her guidance counselor for the following week. It was time to stop hiding and start building the legal foundation that would allow Chloe to have the stable, secure future she deserved. But first, they had to get through the scrutiny of a system that wasn't designed to accommodate unconventional families like that. James just hoped that the evidence of Chloe's well-being would be enough to convince the authorities that sometimes the most unlikely guardian arrangements were also the most successful ones. 6 months later, James stood in the family court of New York County, adjusting his tie nervously as he waited for Judge Sarah Williams to review the final guardianship documents. Beside him, Chloe sat in her best dress, a navy blue outfit they'd bought together for this special day, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The journey to this moment had been far from easy. The school meeting had gone better than expected. Chloe's excellent grades and obvious well-being had convinced the guidance counselor that her living situation was beneficial, not harmful. But the legal process had been background checks, home studies, interviews with social workers, and psychological evaluations had stretched over months. There had been challenges James hadn't anticipated. Some of his business associates had questioned his motives, wondering why a successful bachelor would suddenly want to become guardian to a homeless girl. A few had even suggested it was some kind of publicity stunt. But James had weathered their skepticism, knowing that the only opinions that truly mattered were Chloe's and the court's. The transformation in both of their lives had been remarkable. Chloe had thrived in the stability of a permanent home. Her grades had improved from good to exceptional, and she'd joined the school's debate team and honor society. More importantly, she'd gradually learned to trust that this new life was permanent, that she wouldn't wake up one morning to find herself back on the streets. For James, having Chloe in his life had changed everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. His penthouse, which had once felt like a beautiful prison, now felt like a real home. He'd learned to cook simple meals, help with homework, and navigate the complex social dynamics of 7th grade friendships. He'd discovered that the most satisfying part of his day wasn't closing a business deal, but hearing about Chloe's achievements at school. "Mr. Carter," Judge Williams said, looking up from the documents spread across her bench. "I've reviewed all the reports from the social workers, psychologists, and court-appointed advocates. I've also read Chloe's letter to the court expressing her wishes." James felt his heart racing. After 6 months of legal proceedings, everything came down to this moment. "Chloe," the judge continued, "would you please stand and tell me, in your own words, how you feel about Mr. Carter becoming your legal guardian?" Chloe stood up, her voice clear and confident despite the formal setting. "Your Honor, James has given me more than just a home. He's given me a future. When I was living on the streets, I was just trying to survive day by day. But living with James, I can plan for high school, for college, for becoming a teacher like I've always dreamed." She glanced at James, then back at the judge. "He's never tried to replace my grandmother or make me forget where I came from. Instead, he's honored her memory by helping me become the person she always believed I could be. He comes to my school events, helps with my homework, and listens when I need to talk about missing Grandma." James felt tears stinging his eyes as Chloe continued. "But most importantly, Your Honor, he sees me, not as a charity case or a good deed, but as a person with my own thoughts and dreams and potential. He's taught me that family isn't about sharing the same blood, it's about choosing to love and support each other no matter what." Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Carter, what do you see as your biggest challenge in raising Chloe?" James stood, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, the biggest challenge isn't what most people might think. It's not the financial responsibility, or the time commitment, or learning to be a parent at 45. The biggest challenge is making sure I'm worthy of the trust Chloe has placed in me." He looked at Chloe, then back at the judge. 6 months ago, I thought success meant having the most money or the biggest company or the most expensive possessions. But Chloe taught me that real success is measured by how we treat the people who need our help, especially when there's nothing in it for us. And how has having Chloe in your life changed you? She's made me a better person, Your Honor. Before I met Chloe, I was cynical and suspicious. I assumed the worst about people's motives because I'd been disappointed so many times. But Chloe showed me that there are still people in the world who do the right thing simply because it's right, not because they expect something in return. James paused, thinking about that cold February night when everything changed. She reminded me that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold. They have to be earned through kindness, consistency, and genuine care for others. Judge Williams made some notes, then looked at both of them. The court has reviewed extensive documentation about this case. Chloe's academic performance has been exemplary. Her psychological evaluations show a well-adjusted child who has formed a healthy, appropriate relationship with her proposed guardian. The home study reports describe a safe, nurturing environment with appropriate boundaries and supervision. James held his breath. Furthermore, the judge continued, it's clear to this court that both parties have entered into this arrangement with genuine care and commitment to each other's well-being. Mr. Carter, you've demonstrated that you understand the serious responsibility you're undertaking. And Chloe, you've shown remarkable maturity in your ability to articulate your own needs and desires. Judge Williams picked up her gavel. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that guardianship of Chloe Marie Johnson is hereby granted to James Michael Carter, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The gavel came down with a decisive bang, and Chloe burst into tears of joy, throwing her arms around James in a hug that he returned with equal emotion. It's official, he whispered in her ear. You're stuck with me now. Good, she whispered back. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. As they left the courthouse an hour later, after signing what felt like hundreds of documents and scheduling follow-up appointments, James felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. Not the temporary satisfaction of closing a business deal or acquiring a new company, but the deep, lasting fulfillment of knowing he'd found his true purpose. So, what do we do now? Chloe asked as they walked toward the car. Now we go home and celebrate. And tomorrow, you go to school and I go to work, just like any other normal family. Normal family, Chloe repeated, testing out the words. I like the sound of that. That evening, they had a quiet celebration dinner at home. Chloe's favorite meal of spaghetti and meatballs, which James had finally learned to cook without burning. As they sat at the dining room table that had once been used only for displaying expensive china, James found himself thinking about how much their lives had changed. James, Chloe said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. Can I ask you something I've been wondering about for months? Of course, that night when you found me, when you pretended to be drunk and scattered your valuables around. What would you have done if I had tried to steal from you? James set down his fork, considering the question carefully. Honestly, I probably would have called the police and never thought about you again. I would have written you off as just another street kid, trying to take advantage of a wealthy mark. And then what? You would have gone back to your old life? I suppose so. I would have gone back to my empty apartment and my lonely routine and never realized what I was missing. Chloe nodded thoughtfully. So, in a way, we both passed each other's tests that night. How do you figure? You tested whether I was honest, and I tested whether you were kind. If either of us had failed, we never would have become family. James smiled at her insight. You're absolutely right. We both had to choose to trust each other. Grandma used to say that the most important moments in life happen when we choose to help someone even when we don't have to. Chloe took another bite of spaghetti. She said those choices reveal who we really are inside. What do you think she would say about us becoming a family? Chloe's eyes lit up with the memory of her grandmother. She would say that sometimes God puts people in each other's paths at exactly the right moment. She believed that the best things in life happen when we're brave enough to love people who aren't exactly like us. She sounds like she was incredibly wise. She was. And I think she would have loved seeing how you've changed since that first night. You're not the same suspicious man who tested a homeless girl to see if she would rob him. James laughed. No, I'm definitely not. That man was so afraid of being hurt that he couldn't recognize genuine goodness when he saw it. And I'm not the same scared girl who was sleeping in doorways, afraid to trust anyone. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Later, as James helped Chloe with her algebra homework at the kitchen table, he realized that this ordinary evening, helping with math problems, discussing school projects, planning for the weekend, was exactly the life he'd been searching for without knowing it. "James?" Chloe said as she packed up her books for the next day. "Yeah? Thank you. Not just for taking me in or becoming my guardian or any of the big things. Thank you for proving that there are still adults in the world who keep their promises." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for teaching me that the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or possessions. It's the chance to be part of your life." As Chloe headed off to bed, James stood at the window of his penthouse, looking out at the city lights and thinking about that cold February night that had changed everything. He'd set out to test a homeless girl's honesty, but instead, she'd tested his capacity for love and found it wanting. Then she'd patiently, generously helped him develop that capacity until he became the kind of man who deserved to be called family. The city looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but James saw it completely differently now. Instead of a place full of people trying to take advantage of him, he saw a place full of stories, full of potential, full of people who might need help, or might have help to offer. And somewhere in that vast city, there were probably other Chloes, other children who needed someone to see their worth, to believe in their potential, to choose them as family. James made a mental note to talk to his lawyer about setting up a foundation, a way to help other kids in situations like Chloe's had been. But that was a project for tomorrow. Tonight, he was simply grateful to be exactly where he belonged, in a home filled with love, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most important tests in life are the ones we don't realize we're taking. The billionaire who had pretended to sleep to test a young homeless girl had discovered something worth far more than all his wealth combined. He had discovered the joy of being chosen as family by someone whose love couldn't be bought, only earned through kindness, consistency, and genuine care. And that, James thought as he turned off the lights and headed to his own room, was the greatest success he'd ever achieved.